Good morning, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. I am thrilled to be here and honored to be in a room with folks who I know and have some sense of, as you could tell from Liz's comments. I've been at this for a long time. I have a sense of just how hard the work is that you're doing and that we're trying to do together. And it's really an honor to be with you. I'm going to try to keep my remarks concise today for a variety of reasons, including the fact that I just had a very kind of sobering conversation with my 8-year-old son about my speaking style. I'm going to leave aside the improbability of my having an 8-year-old son. Didn't seem improbable to me, but I learned through Facebook, as you often do when you get a message from somebody that you hadn't talked to in 20 or 30 years. My Facebook picture is myself and my wife Rosemary and our son Nate, and my friend Melinda Greenberg from high school messaged me and she said, "I saw you on Facebook, isn't it wonderful? I have a grandson too." But the reason I'm going to try to be concise is Nate had misbehaved. He's a really good kid, but he'd misbehaved with his babysitter. It was really like almost probably the first time that he'd misbehaved, and my wife Rosemary was very upset about it. She called me at work and she said I needed to come home early so that we could talk to Nate about his character and the choices he makes and his purpose on the planet. And as you can probably tell, Rosemary is a great mom, but she's a little bit intense. And I went home early as instructed to do, and we had this conversation. And Nate was very respectful. It was really kind of a monologue with Rosemary doing most of the monologuing. And after which she had the good sense, after about 15 minutes, Nate was quite quiet, and after about 15 minutes, Ro had the good sense to say, Nate, she said, "Is there anything in turn that you would like to now say to us?" And he just looked us dead in the eye and he said, "Thank you for your little presentation." And so I try to wrap up before I evoke that in an audience. What I really want to talk about today is something that I know resides within each and every one of us in this room, which is how do we do this work more powerfully? How do we do it in a way that really achieves not incremental but transformational impact? How do we address problems not based on the resources that we may have at the moment, but on this scale and at the magnitude in which those social problems really exist? My colleague Amy Salep, who was mentioned, is doing a session right after this on exactly that topic and some of the insights that our work at Community Wealth Partners have gleaned. But we can talk about it this morning as well in a broader sense, based on some of the lessons that we've learned at Share Our Strength. As diverse as our interests are here today, as diverse as are the issues that we work on, we're united by the fact that we are committed to solving many of the toughest problems that our society exists. In fact, they are problems that are so difficult and often affect people who are so voiceless or marginalized economically or politically that there are no markets that exist to solve them. There are no economic or political markets. That's in many cases why nonprofit organizations are created, to fill that gap that exists because it doesn't make economic sense for somebody to try to do it, or because the political system has been paralyzed in trying to solve that particular problem. It's that sense of a market failure that we try to step into, and so we're left with not the easy problems, not the ones that we're most likely to solve, but the ones that are the toughest to solve. And that's the burden that we have accepted upon ourselves. And we're doing it at a time when conditions in this country could not be more difficult for so many Americans. Record levels of poverty, record levels of child poverty, 48 million Americans on the SNAP food stamp program for the first time in the history of this country, half of them being children. The federal government nearly and for all intents and purposes paralyzed in terms of being able to get things done. And this responsibility, this really grave, heavy responsibility on our shoulders, yet not with the resources commensurate to do it. When I think about how difficult this work is, I often think of a New Yorker cartoon where and I keep it on my desk, there's a husband and wife sitting in their living room in their easy chairs, and the puppy dog comes in and is up on its hind legs with its paws up, and the caption just reads, "Once again I find myself in the rather awkward position of having to ask one of you for a biscuit." That is what life often in the nonprofit sector is like. And what we want to talk about today is how we change that, how we do that differently, as I say, how we move to more transformational change. And I want to share some lessons from Share Our Strength, not as a way of saying this is what we did right or this is how smart we were, but actually quite the opposite, which is to say it's pathetic that it took us 28 years to figure out some of these things, and maybe we can provide shortcuts for some of you, because our organization followed a trajectory that I would suspect is very common to many of the organizations that are represented here this morning. It's a classic trajectory for nonprofit organizations. You have a good idea, somebody takes that idea and runs with it, you get some early funding, you get some support, you get some impact, you start to grow. But at some point, the 10th, the 15th, whatever year in, you start to plateau. And your growth is not able to keep up with the problem on this scale that it exists. And so in our case, I started the organization with my sister, as Liz mentioned, in 1984. We had a lot of early growth, but we noticed about 8 or 9 years ago that our growth had really plateaued, that we were stuck. And if you use revenues as a proxy, economically we were stuck. In 2006, 2007, 2008, our revenues were about $13 million a year, give or take 100,000 each year. It wasn't changing, but the need was changing, our expenses were changing, the need was getting greater, the places where we invested was getting greater. So we had to break off of that plateau. And we made a number of decisions which enabled us to do that, so that by 2009 our revenues had gone from the 13 million to 19 million, by 2010 26 million, 2011 33 million, last year I think they were at 44, this year they're at about 49 or 50 million. So for us, really accelerated growth, unlike anything that we had experienced before. And I'll tell you a little bit about what some of those ingredients were for us, at least those ingredients that I think are applicable on a broader scale. The first I would put in the category, number one, as a mentality and a spirit that we brought to the work that I think of as go big or go home. We decided after years of being a grant maker to other organizations that we needed to put a stake in the ground, and we needed to say we're going to try and accomplish a very specific goal. We had not answered for ourselves this very basic question, the most basic question, so obvious that somehow it escaped us for years. What does success look like? Could we answer that with real clarity and precision? What does success look like? For us, success was not just feeding people and making sure that kids got meals. It was really ending childhood hunger, and we said, okay, that's what we're going to do. We spent a lot of time thinking about whether that was the right goal. We thought a lot about something that the writer Jonathan Kozol talks about, which is that you should pick battles that are big enough to matter but small enough to win. And we really liked that construct of big enough to matter, small enough to win. At Community Wealth Partners, we call it bold but believable, something that can really push your organization but can be achieved. And we realized of all the issues we were working on, international hunger, hunger across all age groups in the United States, when it comes to kids in this country who are hungry on a chronic basis, we felt that that was a solvable problem. And once we made that decision, it had once we said we are going to actually end childhood hunger, not going to do it overnight, we're not going to do it in 5 years, it'll take X number of years to do it, but we set a time certain, which was 2015. It had such a catalytic impact on our stakeholders, on our staff, that it really started to accelerate our growth. I should tell you that what the politics behind it were fascinating, because when we pulled together most of the organizations that we work with and said, here's our vision of ending childhood hunger in the United States, we had 60 organizations in the room, and 58 of them afterwards were probably energetically and passionately opposed to what we had suggested. They thought it was going to cost a lot, they thought it wasn't realistic, they thought that there was a real fear that what if we missed, what if we didn't hit our targets. There was a subtext of almost discomfort with the idea of being accountable to this specific goal. But we slowly brought everybody in our community at least around, and it's become a national objective. So this go big or go home was very important for us. The second thing we realized was that investing in our capacity equals impact. that we were going to invest for the long term, and we were going to try to marshal the will and the support to make investments that don't pay off until the long term, because we all know that anything really great that we want to achieve, anything really powerful and big and inspiring, isn't done overnight. It's not done by the end of this year's for our annual report. It's not done by next year. So we were going to make these investments for the long term. We were going to do what the airline attendant says to do every time you buckle your seatbelt, which is when they give you the instructions, you should put your own oxygen mask on first so that you're better able to support those who are dependent on you. And we decided that we would make investments that we hadn't made before in staff, in training, in talent, in strategy, at the expense of some of the direct service we had been doing. I don't mean to pretend that this is an easy decision or to suggest that there's a pot of money sitting on the side for long-term investments. It meant doing less in the short term and doing less with our partners and giving out less money in the community, because we were convinced that we could do 10x or 50x in the long term, and that turned out to be the case by making some of these investments. The third thing we realized was that, and I'd referred to this earlier, that accountability is a really powerful differentiator in a very competitive, crowded, cluttered nonprofit sector. How in the world can a stakeholder decide whether it's better to invest in the food bank or the Texas Hunger Initiative or Teach for America or City Year or Share Our Strength? There's no apples to apples measurements, but at least if an organization will say, look, we're going to be accountable to this goal, you should judge us and you should make future investment decisions on whether we meet it. That's obviously a double-edged sword. If you meet it, you're likely to have more support, as you should. If you don't, you're likely to have less, and one could argue that that's as the market should work as well. So accountability became a very powerful differentiator. The fourth thing for us was realizing, and we came to this very late in the game, particularly for somebody who had a background like myself on Capitol Hill, but we realized that public policy had to be an essential component of virtually everything we do. And in the space we're in, working with kids in this country who are hungry, there was a particular opportunity that we had not been aware of that we seized. And I'll tell you about it in just one equation, and you'll immediately see both the challenge and the opportunity. The opportunity was, at a time of rising hunger, of rising child poverty, of rising need, was that we've got 21 million kids in the United States who get a free school lunch, and all 21 million are eligible for breakfast as well. But when we started this work, only 9 million were getting it. And in the summertime, when the schools are closed, like the summer just passed, only 3 million were getting it. It's bought and paid for all 21 million kids. And in a world where a lot of things are going away, and it's particularly hard to develop new initiatives in the social sector, this was one that we'd already fought and won, but it wasn't being taken advantage of. Well, at lunchtime, the kids are already there. At breakfast, they have to get there earlier. That's logistically complicated for a variety of reasons. There's a stigma attached to doing it. But we started to realize there were other things we could do, like move breakfast from the cafeteria to the first 10 minutes of first period. When we first did that, everybody objected to it. The PTA thought it was going to take away from instructional time, and teachers' union said, our contract says we don't clean up spilled milk, and there were a whole variety of issues, but we overcame them, and we've started to see dramatic results, adding tens of thousands of kids. The first conversation I had with the governor was Governor Bill Ritter of Colorado. This was about 6 years ago, when he was in the middle of his first term. He ended up not running for re-election. Very good man, former Peace Corps volunteer. Went into him and said, do you realize that Colorado ranks 47th out of 50 states in the percentage of kids who are eligible for these programs but not participating? And you've left $125 million in Washington that could come to this state and buy milk from local dairy farmers and bread from local bakers and just be win-win for everybody. And he, as the other dozen governors I've met with in the last 12 months, Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative, looked over to his staff and he said, we've left $100 million to $125 in Washington. Is that possibly true? And they did a kind of quick back of the envelope, like, yes, sir, that's the case. And he said, well, why do we need this nice guy in the blue blazer to tell us that, right? And I said, kind of, politely, hopefully more politely than this, I said, Governor, if it had been a defense contract for $125 million, earmarked for Colorado, couldn't be spent anywhere else, somebody would have been in this governor's office a long time before I figured out how to get here. And it's a testament to really how voiceless children are. This is a good governor who believes in these programs, cares about these kids, and even he didn't know about it. So this notion of building public policy into what we do has for us had a multiplier effect of 1,000-fold. And I've come to, although so much of what we do is in the category of social entrepreneurship, I've come to think of social entrepreneurship without public policy as something akin to a garage band without amps. It's very cool, it's very hip, everybody's into it, but 3 blocks away, nobody knows it's happening. So we've got to find ways to multiply and magnify our voice. The 5th thing I would say is that as much as we work to collaborate together in this sector, we also have to learn to compete. Not so much to compete against each other, but to compete to be the best version of ourselves that we can possibly be. I had the great fortune to be on the board of the Timberland Boot and Clothing Company for about 10 or 11 years, and I had never been on a for-profit or a corporate board before, and I learned a lot just by sitting there. I was very intimidated by joining the board. It was the president of Apple International and the CFO of Colgate-Palmolive and a woman who'd run a huge billion-dollar division of Hasbro, and I just didn't have those skill sets. And I noticed a lot of things different about their work compared to the several nonprofit boards I'm on. First, I noticed that when they made really important decisions, they actually made them on the basis of information. This was a huge shock to my system. But it was quite, the rigor and the discipline there. The most important thing I noticed, though, is they had a sense that the enterprise had to be organized to outperform their peers, and that it had to be that to be competitive at any level, they had to be competitive at every level. So they understood that they weren't competing to sell boots and shoes to us. They were competing to get the very best people who work in fashion and footwear to come and work at Timberland. And what they measured was not just their shoe sales, but how long really great, talented people stayed at Timberland versus how long they stayed at their competitors like Reebok and Cole Haan and Echo and so forth. They were not just competing to sell us t-shirts, excuse me, they were competing to ensure that their brand stood for sustainability and environmentalism and all the things they wanted consumers to know about it, and they measured that. In our world, our reflexes are almost the opposite. Not just, how do we compete to compete at any level, we must compete at every level. They're the opposite. It's how do we do it cheap? How do we do it free? How do we do it pro bono? How do we do it without the best resources that may exist in the world, but the leftover resources? All for the most noble of reasons, because we're trying to do a lot with a little, and we're trying to put everything we can out into the community. But this notion of being competitive, of investing in ourselves, of investing in our capacity for the long term, of understanding that to compete at any level, we must compete at every level, I think is very powerful one. And then the last thing I would say is absolutely critical for every organization to find a way to do what we think of as broaden the base. At Community Wealth Partners, we talk about it as open your circle. I think about it as how do we ensure that our work intersects with the national conversation. I know from my experience at Share Our Strength, working in the field of childhood hunger, as passionate as all of us feel about it, it's not what people on the street are talking about on a day-to-day basis. They're talking about jobs, they're talking about schools, they're talking about the economy. But we happen to believe that our work is very directly related to that. So we did a study, we asked Deloitte to do a study for us, which they ended up doing pro bono. It was about a $300,000 study to look at the schools where Share Our Strength works on programs like breakfast and school nutrition versus the schools where we have not yet been. What they found was that math scores were 17.5% higher in the schools where we had made these investments, that attendance rates were a day and a half longer. I found when I went to 52nd Street Elementary School in Los Angeles a few weeks ago, the principal telling me that they have 850 kids at the school. They've always had 250 with perfect attendance until they switched to our breakfast program, and now they have 439 with perfect attendance. And the correlation between attendance and reading on grade level by third grade, and then ultimately graduation rates, is critical. So many of the investments that people think we cannot afford to make turn out to be investments that we can't afford not to make. But no one's going to make that argument for us. No one's going to do that research for us. No one's going to drive our work to the intersection of the national conversation for us unless we do it ourselves. We know that we can't have a strong America with weak kids. We can't have a productive economy with kids who aren't, and a competitive economy with kids who aren't prepared to produce and compete. And so we've got to make that argument as well. There's so much at stake in us pushing ourselves to do our work in ways different than we have done it before. When I got this invitation to come speak, I was thrilled to have the invitation, and shortly after that I'd read that there was a report that had come out about food insecurity in the United States, and that here in Texas, in Zavala County, Crystal City in Zavala County, probably a couple hours southwest of here, had the highest child food insecurity rate in the country. So with a couple of my colleagues, Chuck Schofield and Katie Dooley, we actually came down the night before last, and we spent all of yesterday in Zavala County at the schools, talking to principals, talking to teachers, talking to kids. The child poverty rate in Zavala County is 50%, and the food insecurity and hunger rates are even higher. They pride themselves on being the spinach capital of the United States. It's an agricultural center. There are 2 statues of Popeye in the town square, 2. And so you would think, as the spinach capital of the United States, that this is a place where you're going to see kids who are strong and healthy and everything that connotes. But of course it turns out to be just the opposite. There are families who are struggling. At the elementary school, the food service director told us that the lunch ladies have a window into hunger because they all have kids of their own that they're trying to feed, and they're taking home, after taxes, $800 a month. They work from 6 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon, many of them $800 a month from the school job. Many of them have a second job. So kids and families struggling against enormous odds. There are no food banks in Zavala County, although the San Antonio Food Bank does a mobile meal drive-through operation there. The Texas Hunger Initiative works there, but there's no rec center where you can create a summer meals site when the schools are closed so that kids can get meals. 12 miles away, there's the Eagle Ford oil boom, 12 miles away. And so there's enormous wealth being created, but in ways that I think are emblematic of so many of the challenges our country faces. It's not reaching the families in Zavala County. It's not impacting them except to make their cost of living a little bit higher. So if we're going to think about what I think is our most important responsibility, to be the voice for the voiceless, and especially to go places, and honestly I didn't go to Zavala County because I thought I could change anything there, but I went because I thought I would be changed by going and by seeing and by feeling what I felt after a day of witnessing people's struggle and bearing witness to the challenges that these amazing kids and their families are grappling with. And this notion of bearing witness, people often come back from a trip like this and say they were moved, and I really love to think about what that means in a literal way, because when you say you're moved, that means you started out one place and you ended up somewhere else. That, to me, is the definition of social transformation. That's the beginning of where all social transformation starts. So our ability, not just to push ourselves to do our work differently, not just to think about how we raise and generate more revenue, not just to think about how we're more efficient at what we do, not just to think about how we do things right, but to make sure that we are doing the right things, and to be that voice for the voiceless, and to bear witness in all of our work, to tell that story, to drive it to the intersection of the national conversation, is an awesome responsibility. I've worked with many of the organizations in this room. I know there's no group more prepared to meet that responsibility. I'll leave you with the words that I think about a lot from the writer James Baldwin, who once said, "These are all of our children, and we shall either profit by or pay for whatever they become." We shall either profit by or pay for whatever they become. With your help, we'll make sure they become engaged citizens in a country that has the resources, has the talent, and hopefully has the will to be the greatest country on earth. Thank you so much for having me here today.